The second thing, all right. And then maybe it's actually nice because it's a small group for the participants or the audience to also introduce, unless you feel uncomfortable. See Anne and Balas, um, you want to say a few words about who you are, what you do. All right. In that case, we will continue, and I'd like to give Santino the floor. So I mentioned a few words about the two discussants. Now, just briefly about Santino. Santino is a great scholar, a lecturer at Atlanta University, where he focuses on human rights norms, global governance, and foreign aid. The author of this book, but there's a lot that he's also working on right now. So I can imagine that you'll be back for or you can be back for a lot of sessions like these in the near future. But let's give the floor to Santino.
Hi, good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Good morning to Bonnie and good afternoon to all of us here based in Europe. So first of all, thanks a lot to the two conveners of the Perpetrator Studies Network, Dr. Knittel and Dr. Williams for this opportunity. So I'd like to, and also for the two discussants whom I deeply respect. We may not have the opportunity before to meet in person, but I've been reading both of your work. So for me, so I really look forward to this opportunity, and also to Daniel for moderating this session. So let me just share my very brief PowerPoint presentation. So the presentation will just highlight first the core puzzle that animates the book Aid Imperium, United States Foreign Policy in Post-Cold War Southeast Asia. And then I'll get into the broader trends between United States foreign aid and human rights, and then focus more specifically on one case study of United States foreign aid and how it actually interacted with other domestic variables in war and terror period in the Philippines. So I think this is a good way to actually reach out to the members of the network who are much more interested in the causes and the consequences of the perpetration of violence. So the core puzzle of the book constitutes two main questions. So first, broadly speaking, does foreign aid undermine human rights in recipient countries? And if so, how and under what set of conditions does it impact on human rights outcomes, particularly physical integrity rights? So I focus on physical integrity rights, so the freedom of the human person from physical and mental forms of harassment, extrajudicial killings, torture from state actors. So I use the term foreign strategic assistance in the book because this is an aggregate term that focuses both on ideational components of foreign aid, so particularly the shared discourses of recipient actors, but also the donor government, in this case, the United States, but also the material element of foreign aid, which is actually the one that is easily quantifiable in most cases in the United States foreign aid. So that could be military aid or economic aid. I believe that when we look into various cases of political violence, the book started from this. So I was personally bothered with the idea that when I coming from my field in political science, especially starting in comparative politics before I shifted to international relations, there's always this idea amongst many scholars in the global north who basically exoticize places in the global south, saying that crisis of human rights or state violence are generated only by domestic factors. And this is a methodologically nationalist approach in understanding political violence. But actually, what I've seen, at least from my positionality in Southeast Asia is that a lot of these cases of political violence are generated by the converging interests of the political elites, not only in those regions or in those countries, at least in Southeast Asia, but also those powerful countries. And in this case, that's really the overarching motivation behind Aid Imperium, aside from my personal experience in the military before. The core argument is that because of this realization, I highlight the importance of converging interests, particularly those in power, and in some cases, especially in the post-Cold War period, this appetite for democratization, which also led to lower or basically better human rights outcomes spearheaded by civil society activists and perhaps non-elite actors. So I argue that donor and recipient governments' converging interests and shared policy preferences, together with the domestic legitimacy of the recipient government, primarily shape the purposes of foreign aid plus domestic resources. And the way that these two interact will have ramifications on whether or not foreign aid plus domestic resources will be used to not only kill or perhaps perpetrate violence against armed political actors, but also unarmed political dissidents, civil society activists, journalists, for example, and other forms of unarmed political opposition. So the overarching realization here is that, as perhaps a constructivist at heart, foreign aid is neither good nor bad, although I tried to make this much more nuanced towards the conclusion. But really, it's about how we use aid and for what purpose. For what purposes do we actually use aid? So this is just a broader characterization of who are basically the recipients of US foreign aid, particularly in terms of state actors. And what we found out was that most of the states who are receiving foreign aid are, perhaps political scientists call them as hybrid regimes. So these are regimes which are electoral democracies or constitutional democracies in paper, but they experience a lot of incidents of political violence, and there are severe problems when it comes to physical integrity rights outcomes. And despite several decades of foreign aid assistance from the United States, and this assistance is usually, at least from the 1970s, from the Carter period, usually justified through the discourse of democracy promotion and good governance, which has its own problems. This foreign aid did not actually stimulate consistently, better human rights outcomes. So in the book, I offered a convergence, what I call as the convergence theory of foreign aid and human rights. So what I argue is that the United States and the two countries that are the main focus of the book, so Thailand and the Philippines. So Thailand and the Philippines are the two mutual defense treaty allies of the US in the Southeast Asian region. I argue that there are times in which, for example, in the 1990s, the converging interests of American and Southeast Asian elites were really about market liberalization, non-militaristic interests, economic development, and a wide range of militaristic and non-militaristic outcomes. This kind of interest convergence, led to the absence of what I call a selective political repression, or this is the mechanism through which political actor or the state, for example, target unarmed political actors for killings or for torture. I argue that if the interest convergence focuses on a wide range of interests, we get a much better human rights outcomes. And most of these human rights violations are generated through an enduring culture of impunity because of the judiciary and coercive state apparatus, but also in terms of the collateral abuses committed by several agents within the police and military agencies. There are 5 case studies in the book. Obviously, I will not talk about all the 5 cases, but I'd like to focus on, in the last 3 minutes, I'd like to focus on the case of the Arroyo regime. So Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was the president of the Philippines from 2001 to 2009. The first mechanism that links foreign aid with human rights or physical integrity rights in Southeast Asia is through the process that I call a strategic localization of security discourse. This was a few weeks after the 9/11 terror attacks. The Arroyo government paid a lot of money to lobbying firms in Washington, D.C. There was active lobbying in Washington, D.C. to convince the US government that terrorism in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines, for example, the armed Islamic insurgency in southern Philippines and Mindanao was operationally linked to Al Qaeda terror network. They framed the country as the indispensable partner in the US led war on terror. And through this war on terror discourse, right, the Arroyo government conflated terrorists with peaceful activist groups. So that were critical of government policies. And later on, we'll see a lot of cases in which student activists from progressive public universities were forcibly disappeared under this regime. You can see this through the discourses of Arroyo. So, for example, the war on terror was not only about armed Islamic insurgents in the context of the Philippines, but also, she said, and I quote, "We will wage war against criminals, terrorists, drug addicts, kidnappers, smugglers, and those who terrorize factories that provide jobs." It was also through this time that the Duterte, so the current president of the Philippines, was the mayor and was in fact a very close ally of the Arroyo regime. So there were several pages, I think, that I discussed the early years or the pre-presidential years of Duterte, which might be interesting for others. And the same thing for Bush. I mean, Bush, there were personal links between the Bush family, the Clinton family, and also with the Arroyo family. Arroyo was educated in the United States for her bachelor's. Bush provided a lot of administrative discretion on the part of Arroyo in terms of this huge amounts of military aid that was given to the Philippines. The second mechanism is when their interests converged, there was the mobilization of resources, and the Arroyo regime received a lot of funds coming from the United States that were geared towards the coercive apparatus of the Philippine state. So, for example, in this quotation, she was very happy expressing the increase of 1.9 million before her active lobbying to around 400 million US dollars during her time. The final and the top 3 biggest recipients of US aid, at least in 2004 and throughout her regime, were the Philippine State Security Apparatus agencies, so the Central Intelligence Services of the military and the police, but also the National Intelligence Coordinating Agency. Arroyo branded progressive and nonviolent organizations, which were critical of specific government policies as terrorists. So there's a lot of these kinds of speeches that really dehumanize, in many cases also, progressive forms of political dissent. There are a lot of intervening factors. Arroyo was very much afraid that she will be booted out of office, and that's why she put a lot of former high-ranking military officers in the cabinet positions within the government as a way to buy political loyalty. But foreign aid was also used to actually lure various agents of the coercive apparatus to actually implement this sort of regime consolidation on the part of the regime. There were many cases, just one case here of political violence. There's the violence called Maguindanao Massacre. At the time, the Time magazine viewed it as the world's single worst attack on journalists ever recorded. It happened in Maguindanao, which is a province in southern Philippines, and it was ruled by the Ampatuan clan. And when there was an independent government investigation, including the Commission on Human Rights and the National Bureau of Investigation, what they found out was that in the Ampatuan mansion, they found out a lot of military weapons bearing the United States Department of Defense arsenal. So you can also see here how possibly this smoking gun evidence that the Arroyo regime used these kinds of weapons and other forms of material support from the United States to buy the political loyalty of other politicians in many critical regions of the country. So you can see here that a lot of these incidents of state-based violence were largely concentrated in southern Philippines, where you have this armed Islamic insurgency. In that, initially, it helped Arroyo to paint the picture that the Philippines requires a lot of military resources in the context of the global war on terror, because purportedly the armed Islamic insurgency in the southern region of the country was linked to the global war on terror. But also you can see that there were a lot of collateral abuses and a lot of political opposition members and activists were forcibly disappeared in this context. I think I'll end on that before I exceeded already a lot of time, but I look forward to our discussions later on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Santino. Yeah, just before we turn to Yuna, I noticed that in the chat, Anne and Balaz wrote a few things. Anne's microphone is not working, so it's a little bit tough to introduce. Balaz explains that he's a peace building consultant and is here to listen and learn. But Balaz, feel free to also share. No need to do so, but if you want to do so at the end. All right. So I'd like to turn to Yuna. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much. So in, I think, the 12, 15 minutes that I have, my aim is to highlight some parts of the book's what I find to be the main contributions of the book and what I found quite interesting from my perspective as somebody who studies international relations. And then I'll kind of end by having some broader reflections and some kind of questions for Santino maybe to address if he so has the time, kind of broad, sort of pushing the argument further into further research. So in general, so perhaps as my introduction has suggested, I am not an expert on foreign aid or the politics of foreign aid, and coming from that positionality of slightly from a different topical area, I found the book to be really full of rich kind of empirical information as well. So I learned a lot just reading the cases that kind of forms a core of the analysis. At the same time, as a IR theory nerd, I found the theoretical contribution of the book incredibly sophisticated as well. So there's a lot for everybody depending on what angle you're looking for. So I would highly recommend actually looking at the book in its entirety. So I particularly appreciated how the conceptualization of American foreign aid was from the get-go expansively defined through both material and discursive terms. I do think quite a lot gets lost by only focusing on the material aspect. And if you're from the different camp of thinking about international politics, only focusing on the kind of narrative framing and the discursive framing of kind of American strategic interest. Clearly, those two things work hand in hand, and we do acknowledge that in passing in a lot of our work, but kind of conceptually bringing those together into one package, I think was kind of a big theoretical contribution of this, of Santino's work here. Secondly, I think it was really important to bring Southeast Asia into the front and center of theorizing about international politics more generally. And this probably says a lot more about international relations as a discipline rather than anything else in the world. But coming from this disciplinary background, it is quite noteworthy that empirically what we're kind of doing with Southeast Asia as not just a theory testing ground, like a repository of data, like a lot of people do tend to treat parts of the world that is not the global north, but actually kind of a rich area for bottoms-up IR theory building in and of itself was, I think, quite useful and a direction that probably many scholars should be taking as we kind of much more turn towards what some people call global IR turn, or the move towards a much more expansive or decolonial or truly global understanding of how international relations works in the real world. And more specifically, I think we see very clearly as one of the key theoretical payoffs of theorizing from Southeast Asia is that we end up with a very rich picture of how agency is generated and how agency operates. which unfortunately is a picture that gets often lost, especially when we're dealing with relationships that are structured through highly unequal terms, right? The degree of inequality that is structures that relationship often blinds us to the fact that even those who are in weaker positions, states or kind of groups or organizations that are weaker in that relationship can still generate agency meaningfully and therefore change the way the dynamic operates. And I think we see that a lot quite clearly, just to kind of zoom out a little bit, in our current sort of hot takes about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, right? So much has been said about the West and NATO and Russia, and it's very difficult, surprisingly difficult, to really theoretically and analytically and meaningfully capture the way in which Ukraine is an agentic actor in this entire scenario. Similarly, I think what Santino's book does is that by starting from Southeast Asia, there's no question about that this is where we're generating this theory from, allows us to also see much more clearly how even in an unequal condition, weaker states are still agentic kind of actors with meaningful agency in that relationship, and therefore also changes the way international dynamics also work. So I think that's kind of one of the kind of key takeaways and contributions, both from a theoretical and empirical side. A different way to put this kind of theoretical contribution is to kind of think about it in terms of how the hegemonic power of the Imperium, which Santino defines as unequal power relations that constitute the processes through which a dominant political entity, such as the US, shapes the socio-political formations, norms, and material distributed politics of subordinate states and society, how that Imperium actually structures political relations, right? And this kind of structuring is not one-sided and unilateral, but it is in fact dynamic and kind of multifaceted. In thinking about the ways in which the Imperium, the structure of the Imperium structures international politics, I think the book's core argument resonates with kind of two other theoretical arguments from different areas of research, which is kind of interesting to kind of relate to and perhaps kind of push it further. And the first area that really kind of jumped to mind as I was reading this was thinking about Bayart's argument about extroversion in comparative African politics, post-colonial African politics. Now, Bayart argues that, core argument kind of starts from the understanding that dependency, the condition of dependency, is not the condition of non-agency and subjugation. Rather, it is a condition of integration and kind of intimate kind of imbrication of both the post-colonial African states and the more kind of powerful states in the international system. And in that, agency is created by creating and capturing the rent that can be generated through that dependent relationship. And that is kind of the core argument of extroversion in Bayart. In doing so, Bayart is painting African states, post-colonial African states, as active agents in their own condition of dependence, sometimes opposing it, but also sometimes joining it strategically, refuting this dichotomy between nationalism and collaboration, or simply subjugation and subversion. There's a lot of kind of gray areas in between where interesting things are happening in a political way. It's not always positive from a human rights perspective. It's not always positive from kind of more normative evaluations of what's going on, but nonetheless, the weaker actor is still changing the dynamic through which they are interacting with more powerful global phenomenon. I think in that sense, there's some resonances and similarities clearly with the way in which Santino sees the structure of the Imperium structuring that relationship between America and the recipient countries here. However, I think what's kind of a slightly different and nuanced way, different direction that Santino's argument takes is that there's a greater deal of emphasis on how mutually beneficial relationships are constructed and shape the way in which human rights outcomes are affected between the donor state and the recipient state. So it's not simply this slightly more one-sided, or perhaps one-sided for analytical purposes, a picture that Bayart prints of there is this global phenomenon, discourses of human rights, discourses of development, and African states are utilizing it to their benefit. But Santino takes it a bit further to say that there is this kind of mutual dynamic of you help me out, you help, I help you out. There's kind of mutually beneficial rents to be gained on each side of the equation. This, I think, really shows greater possibility for the conclusions of the book to be put into further dialogue with other areas of research in political science and international relations, particularly those who are interested in like what happens under the condition of hegemony, right? So how do weaker states or weaker actors, generally speaking, act under the conditions of hegemony? That goes beyond the aid recipient relationship, that can be kind of pushed much further onwards in terms of topics. And this is a rich area of research and something that increasingly, I think, international relations, thankfully, is becoming much more interested in, particularly as we move away, potentially in the actual world, from a unipolar system to like a much more multipolar world. This understanding of what this hegemonic relationship or kind of unequal relationship means for agency, I think, is becoming a very pressing political one as well for various actors around the world. And just to give you an example of a different kind of area that has kind of similar resonances with Santino's conclusions in the book, I think a lot of the literature, particularly those that have been written in the more recent decade on international criminal justice and transitional justice, has a lot of resonances with the way in which Santino imagines or kind of theorizes the Imperium, the structure of the Imperium, to condition the way in which the states are interacting within it. Precisely, specifically regarding kind of the book's rather, I don't want to say pessimistic, but someone I would perhaps say realistic or kind of measured way in which aid actually changes or fundamentally transform the conditions on the ground in the recipient countries. Because what we see is a much more kind of nuanced and kind of measured picture of there's a limitation to how much fundamental transformation either side can really affect, but rather we have kind of a mutual sort of kind of compromise in what the actual outcome looks like. Similarly, I think in the early days of kind of the advent of international criminal justice, this is, if you think about even the days before the ICC was actually established in 2002, there was a great deal of, I think, enthusiasm and optimism in thinking that external judicial interventions, like in the form of the ICC, will have a fundamentally transformative effect on the societies that they intervene in, right? That it will be this kind of shock to the system that will have a very different kind of political outcome. Accountability through law, through these international courts, will change something fundamentally on the ground. Empirically, since the inception of institutions like the International Criminal Court, unfortunately has shown that instead of having these deeply transformative effects, it does have some kind of effect on the way on the ground politics works, but oftentimes the outcome is much more measured and much more murky. And in fact, we see increasingly, or kind of quite frequently, the ICC or other international institutions like the ICC become much more implicated into the domestic political dynamics of the ground rather than transforming it whole scale. So it becomes a player in that kind of market of politics as opposed to changing the terms of the markets in and of itself. And this has kind of been part of my conclusions and my work working on Uganda and DRC and other places, but also more recently Umar Bar's work, Ba's work on the ICC and African states, as well as Phil Clark's work on the ICC and the long duration of African politics, has suggested that rather than being a deeply transformative experience, it has been kind of an experience marked by mutual compromise and sort of mutual imbrication, right? So you kind of right-size the ICC back to kind of a more domestic player as opposed to a truly a different kind of international player. And in this sense, I think there's a lot of parallels to the way Santino finds aid operating, the effects of aid looking like on the ground politics. Sometimes aid has some kind of effect on the way domestic dynamics work, but oftentimes we see the clearest effect of aid when it comes to when there is already a convergence of interest with the domestic political elites. In other words, it's not changing things from the ground up, it's simply kind of implicating itself in existing power dynamics here. And so here we're kind of left with a pessimistic, or at least more measured picture of how much change is affected by external forces, right? And how much change can we expect from these kind of big flagship global policy measures that we often give a lot of kind of credence and hope towards, right? What's the actual outcome of that? And so I think this is kind of an interesting reflection point to have, especially in this moment as we, more broadly, I think, particularly in Western states, there are a lot of rethinking and kind of reconfiguring about political priorities, normative commitments, and also particularly perhaps kind of international commitments, right? So I'm currently in the United Kingdom. The UK has a very different way of thinking about what their role in the world is and what kind of external interventions that they will be able to and willing to do in the future than say 10 years ago. So at this kind of moment of reflection, kind of thinking about the real life effects of all of these external interventions that these countries have done, I think is quite useful. So in the last kind of 2-ish minutes, I want to end with a couple of questions that hopefully we can discuss or just kind of pin for further kind of reflection. First is that one question that occurred to me as I was reading this was this time frame of the global war on terror, and how. And so if we kind of think about American foreign policy very generally being guided by liberal internationalism, let's say since the end of World War I, kind of broadly speaking, it seems like global war on terror is one of the two kind of key points in which the internationalism part is alive, but the liberal side is somewhat more compromised, right? And so, so I was wondering if we can kind of think about the global war on terror in the same tradition, for example, as we would think about Cold War foreign policy aims, right? America was very happy to support lots of terrible regimes around the world, as long as, you know, it meets the kind of goals, hard security goals of containment and the bipolar system. So is this story, can this story be kind of put in a larger picture of American liberal internationalism when liberal part kind of dies off, right? This is American internationalism, full stop. Another question that I had was your focus on the book's focus on physical integrity rights, and this kind of comes out a little bit more in the empirical parts on the side as well. But I was kind of wondering, so if we accept the argument that there is a relationship and potentially a negative relationship between aid and physical integrity rights, then, you know, what's the ripple effect on other forms of human rights protection in that country? Is there a ripple effect that we can expect? And is there anything counterintuitive that happens in that realm? And the final thing is perhaps just a little bit more about your research process. And I was very interested to kind of read your kind of positionality being very explicit in the get-go from your introduction, as well as formally being a civilian analyst in the military in the Philippines, etc. And I don't know if you've seen the recent piece by Umar Bar on the Millennium Journal, where we talk about, you know, researching home and all the kind of complications that come with it. So if you had any reflections about, you know, how you felt kind of researching home, both in kind of the sense of the country, but also in terms of the role that you've had previously, I'd be very interested to hear that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Yuna, for this very, very rich discussion. I'm sure Santino will have a hard time deciding, you know, how to respond and especially what to respond to. But this was really great. I'm going to turn to Bonnie. I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me right? Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much. Delighted to be part of these important conversations. I'm going to do pretty much what Dr. Hans has done, in that I will provide some sense of what I consider the main contributions of the book. Also raise some questions that I hope can be the focus of deliberations afterwards. But there will be some overlap in what we talked about. So apart from my academic hat as a professor of legal history and international human rights, I also wear a policy hat as the United Nations Independent Experts on the Right to Development. And so this book was doubly attractive to me. First, for its many academic contributions, conceptual and theoretical, but also for the interventions it makes in the area of international development, the nexus between international human rights and international development, the construction of aid, or what Professor Santiago calls foreign strategic support, as a development practice. And I will be speaking to a bit to both of these contributions. I have delineated my contributions, what I think are the most salient contributions of this book, into 5 key areas, and I will go through them one by one. The first is a rather fundamental one, and it is the terminological and discursive shifts that this book offers, and it's a shift that fundamentally challenges orthodox concepts and dominant methodology. So at the beginning of the book, Professor Santiago opts for the term foreign strategic support rather than aid. He argues that he deploys the notion of foreign strategic support because it constitutes all forms of US foreign military and economic disbursement, and the strategic political discourses and diplomacy that underpin them. Foreign aid, he reminds us, only refers to the material resources given by donor country, while foreign strategic support, a term he prefers, is an aggregate term which includes material resources, political support, and other forms of a country's non-material influence on partner governments. I think this is a very important, though subtle contribution, because as we all know as scholars, the lens that we choose to look at a particular issue often determines the picture we paint. And so by starting off with what I call, what I would consider an important conceptual and discursive and even terminological shift, Professor Santiago allows us new insights into an old story. As Professor Santiago rightly notes, the term foreign strategic support offers wider explanatory coverage than the term foreign aid, and I couldn't agree more. It considers both the material and mediational aspects of US foreign policy, and more significantly, it departs from the dominant social science literature that tends to focus on aid as material resource. This conceptual and terminological shift alone, I would argue, allows for a different and refreshing perspective to what has been cast for so long as a story of aid and a story of resource assistance. So that for me is the first contribution that jumps out, the discursive and terminological shift. The second important contribution that these books make for me is the attention to discourse and the way that discourse shapes foreign support. As I read this book, I was struck by the very effective use of a methodology that I find rarely used in the field of international relations or comparative politics. And this is critical discourse analysis. It is a methodology that social linguistics will be familiar with. It is a methodology and a theoretical framework that legal historians will be familiar with, but which I haven't really seen international relations or comparative policy scholars used very often. And I think Professor Santiago deploys this methodology and theoretical framework very effectively in this book. A word about the essence of critical discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis enables us to go beyond the face value of speech and text. Speech and writing are not taken at their face value, but analyzed based on the practices and rules which produce this text and the methodological organization of thinking underlying them. As evident in Professor Santiago's book, discourse analytical methods are especially useful because they allow us to pay better attention to the ways that power, dominance, and inequality are enacted, performed, reproduced, and resisted through text and talk in different international political contexts. Discourse analysis draws attention to the often subtly expressed power of dominant groups as interpreted in laws, rules, norms, and habits. Discourse analysis as a research methodology is deployed quite effectively in this volume. As Professor Santiago notes, and I quote, "The shared discourses and publicly stated policy preferences of donor and recipient governments are reflective of how and in what ways foreign aid is most likely to be used." Related to this conceptual and theoretical contribution of the book, I also find very useful the distinction that Professor Santiago makes between what he calls selective political repression or targeted abuse and erroneous coercive practices, what he calls collateral abuse, which all converge in physical integrity rights outcomes. So here we have two very significant methodological and theoretical contributions. The first is the effective and creative use of discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis in a field where it has been rarely deployed, and also this theoretical framing of physical integrity rights outcomes that really makes us better understand the broad range of human rights abuses and repression that he engages in this book. I consider this a contribution that goes way beyond the field of international relations, of comparative politics. It is a methodological contribution that scholars across several disciplines will find useful. I certainly will find this very, very intriguing and useful. The third contribution of Professor Santiago's book is the elucidation of the causal relationship between foreign aid and human rights. And this is a big question in international human rights scholarship. As Professor Santiago correctly notes, and I'm quoting him here, our knowledge about the causal relationship between foreign aid and human rights is still at its infancy. In fact, I would go further to say it is almost non-existent. And so it is refreshing to see Professor Santiago tackle this gap head on. And just to give you a sense of how important this contribution is in human rights scholarship, I would refer to the book by Michael Burnett titled Empire of Humanity, A History of International Humanitarianism. In that book, Michael Burnett makes a distinction between human rights and humanitarianism. He says these are two different things. There is a humanitarian impulse and there's a human rights impulse. Burnett argues that while human rights rely on the discourse of rights, humanitarianism is predicated on the discourse of needs. Human rights are thus based on the legal code, while humanitarianism is based on a moral code. So there is this conventional wisdom within human rights scholarship that the fields of international humanitarianism, what we will call foreign aid, will fall under that. And human rights were really two parallel streams, you know, the occasional connections between them. But we're really talking about two different concepts here. I have long disagreed with this hard distinction. For me, this is a distinction without a difference. Humanitarianism is founded as much on a discourse of needs as it is on a discourse of rights. As Professor Santiago shows in this book, strategic foreign support or foreign aid both have humanitarian and human rights dimensions. The book offers unique insights that allows us to begin to bridge this conceptual gap, to investigate the role of foreign aid and its domestic outcomes, political outcomes, human rights outcomes on recipient countries. The book provides insights into the ways in which foreign strategic assistance in the form of aid and diplomacy shape physical integrity rights in recipient states. As the author notes, the co-variational relationship of US aid with human rights is not unique to the case studies of the Philippines and Thailand that he studies. This is true of many other contexts. In the African context that I am more familiar with, 10 countries that received the most US aid in 2022 were African countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, all of which have exceptionally weak human rights record. And one of the questions that I would like Professor Santiago and others who work in this field to explore is to examine the nexus, the foundation of this nexus between international foreign strategic support and human rights violations, human rights record. I have the hypothesis, and I will invite Professor Santiago to reflect on this when he gets the opportunity to speak. And the hypothesis is that Western aid, in this case US aid, is often contingent on the recipient's country's predisposition to adopting neoliberal economic policies, which in many cases creates economic hardship for people and precipitates popular resistance against governments. And we see this in structural adjustment programs. We see this in austerity measures mandated by the World Bank, IMF, and other Bretton Woods institutions. Now, such popular resistance intensifies the authoritarian tendencies of recipient governments that are already predisposed to repression and human rights violations. So in some ways, Western aid becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. It pushes government into taking unpopular policies as part of the conditionalities for aid. That triggers popular opposition and support, forcing states already predisposed to authoritarianism to become even more authoritarian. So it is some kind of a vicious circle, a feedback loop that shows the kind of correlative arguments that Santiago makes in this book. Fourth contribution, I think, agency of actors in the global south. And this is something that Professor Anne has already talked about in her commentaries. Professor Santiago highlights the political agency of global south actors in a way that few studies who dealing with this subject do. He emphasizes how they negotiate and charge their political trajectories alongside powerful actors in the global north. The book shows how aid recipient governments strategically frame their discourses and interests in ways that adapt to the preferences of their own domestic publics and the donor governments. The convergence of donor interests and of the interests of donor and recipient governments, together with the recipient's government's level of domestic legitimacy, Professor Santiago argues, affects the scope and magnitude of states-initiated human rights abuses. Now, the question I would have in this regard is, what are the limits of agency? While Professor Santiago really articulates the agency of global south actors, I would like to think that these are mediated forms of agency, and perhaps there needs to be a bit more reflection on the limits of agency, because there's always the risk that in ascribing agency to global south or even any marginalized actors in our analysis, we try to, it distracts from power and it detracts from the overwhelming power of hegemonic forces. So some commentary on the limits of agency and the mediation of agency in this context might be useful. And then finally, the fifth contribution, and this is something that's already been spoken about, but I think this is really important. The last point about researching home, I put that down. I have to go read that book because it sounds really interesting. How personal experience shapes our research agenda, particularly those of us in the global south who contribute to global debates about human rights and international relations. Very often, this comes out of personal lived experiences, personal insights, and gaps that we see, very obvious gaps that we see, what I call epistemological silences and epistemological hierarchies that confront us from the very beginning of our scholarship. And there's always this yearning desire to, one, explain these silences and gaps, and also do so in a way that reckons with the perspectives of those in the global south. So I see that impulse, one that I'm keenly familiar with, animating this work and enriching it in the ways that Professor Santiago addresses these questions. Third generation family member involved with the military, worked as a civilian analyst for the government. These are all lived experiences that bring very unique perspectives to the important international questions that Professor Santiago addresses in this book. Finally, a question that I think I will really benefit from, and here now I'm putting on my hat as a UN independent expert on the right to development. One of the points that I do not think many of the books dealing with this topic sufficiently address is how human rights are defined in the context of foreign aid. There's an assumption in many of the scholarship, and I would say to some extent, even in Professor Santiago's book, that we know what human rights are. We know exactly what it means. I think that is not quite resolved. We do not know for sure what they mean. We need to explore the political and ideological considerations that inform how both donor and recipient states understand human rights in the context of humanitarian and military aid. Now, I'll give you an example of a debate that I'm very familiar with at the United Nations. Western states, led by the European Union, promote what they call a human rights approach to development. And this means that international development interventions should be informed by human rights principles such as civil and political rights. In contrast, the Chinese and many Eastern countries are promoting what they call a development approach to human rights, which frames economic and social development as indices of human rights in and of themselves. So you have two contrasting perspectives of how human rights intersects with development. The human rights approach to development and the development approach to human rights. So when we talk about human rights in the context of aid, we need to really engage these contestations of what human rights are and how the political and ideological contingencies influence how states interpret and define this right. I'll stop there. My 2 minutes is up, but I just wanted to say this was a very interesting book, and I look forward to the discussions that will follow.
Thank you. That was another very rich set of observations. So I'll just quickly turn to Santino and give him the opportunity to respond. Santino, take a few minutes, and then we'll take it from there. See if Anne and Balazs want to contribute, and otherwise we can engage with each other. All right.
Yeah, thank you so much to Professor Bao and Dr. Yunahan for these reflections. When I published this book, I thought like I wanted to move on to other projects, but with these engagements, I felt like it would take several years to perhaps write another piece that will probably come out from the discussions here. So I'd like to address point by point at least the questions, concluding remarks from the two discussants. So first, how human rights are defined. So let me start with Professor Ibhawa, and then I'll move to Dr. Yunahan. So how human rights are defined in the context of foreign aid. I think that first I wanted to step back and see first what human rights are. And over the years, both also as a person, I mean, I was in the Philippines in 2016 I was in an on-leave position from a tenure track in the US, and this was the time when the so during the first few weeks of the Duterte presidency, the pictures that you can see in the New York Times who are victims of drug wars, I've seen this twice in the city center of Manila. And for me, when I was listening to his speeches to Duterte and other political leaders, the question that comes up to my mind is like, what does it mean when we say human rights? Because Duterte was also advocating for human rights, but of course in a very sinister way. And in recent years, I tend to believe that, disregarding foreign aid first, but human rights are really meta concepts that are normatively appealing, and that they can be weaponized, instrumentalized in various ways. So in my book, Aid Imperium, I say that human rights in the 1990s was that it was only about physical integrity rights and the right to vote. That's it. And then the right for the market to take place. And there's a neoliberal element. I muted that in the book, but I wanted to write something in some other articles that I published. I look into neoliberalism, but that was not really the focus of the book. But you see there that 1990s was a place for just providing minimum rights so that the market could take place and market actors, especially the powerful market actors, could engage. And I thought that was a very useful and strategic way for the US and the political elites and some civil society actors thought was really appropriate at the time. So that was my thinking. And of course, some other sinister actors could use human rights in very sinister ways. Arroyo, for example, or Taksin said, like, in order for us to secure human rights in democracy, we need to implement these repressive measures. Right. So, and in a way, this was a deliberate way of weaponizing meta concepts. So, human rights for me would be like other types of meta concepts, normatively appealing concepts such as peace, development, justice, that could be, instrumentalized for various purposes. Second, and this I think would touch on the idea of neoliberal development and human rights. I felt that that the idea of human rights, per se, at least in the Western context, and I think in some other global South context, I think the two discussants are well-known experts of Africa theory, but I think in Southeast Asia too, in some other pre-colonial context, the idea of rights was really a balance between the collective and the individual. And I think this might be the case as well in the African context. Please correct me if I'm wrong, in the case of Ubuntu. But I felt that the way that we discuss here in the North is that it was individualistic. Rights as an individual. And I've seen this especially in the COVID-19 pandemic here in the Netherlands when we talk about face masks, right? It was only about like my liberty not to wear a face mask during the early weeks of the pandemic. It's because it was couched in the language of rights. And there is a danger here because the individual freedom will not be secured without also looking into how others are being affected through the exercise of this freedom. And I think that there are other broader questions such as material distribution, right? And how, even in the context of a rights-abiding society, we see a lot of billionaires and oligarchs thriving in a supposedly democratic context. So, and these are questions for me that human rights cannot solely answer because of its individualistic focus. I'd like to address the questions about the time frame of the global war on terror. I think this was a very, this is a very important, insightful question, because I felt that liberalism did not really die during the global war on terror per se. I thought that it evolved. And again, liberalism is one of those meta concepts that could be castigated, that could be instrumentalized depending on the context. So I felt that, even Arroyo or Thaksin, and in many cases, the Bush administration used the language of democracy promotion through violence, right? And I felt that there's liberalism there, to the extent that liberalism was used as a discourse to justify something extremely lethal and perhaps in some case genocidal for societies that are being affected by this violence. So I thought that liberalism has always been there as a way to justify sinister intentions and plans of those who are in power. And I think that's a tragedy of liberalism. That's just my initial thinking here. The effects of physical integrity rights in terms of its ripple effects, I felt that the way that the insistence in the 1990s on physical integrity rights left very important. So they discarded or muted a lot of important questions about distribution, material distribution. In the case of Thailand and the Philippines, in many other global South contexts, entrenched oligarchs or billionaires actually thrived in the context of a constitutional democracy. And the way that they conduct business and increasing material inequality discarded economic rights or the right to decent living of millions of people in those societies, both in the global North and also here in the global South. Finally, sorry for this. I think I only have 1 minute to answer the question about, but I'll answer the positionality research question. So the research process for me. So I started in philosophy, and I wrote a thesis many years ago in philosophy about the universality of human rights in the context of the East Asian values debate. One examiner from the university that I had in the Philippines said, like, this was really not the work of philosophy, but more of political science. So that motivated me to shift to political science, because I was interested in practical questions from a theoretical perspective. And the insistence in political science was really about comparative politics. And I felt that a lot of the variables used to explain crises or outcomes within, at least from my perspective back then in Southeast Asia, were just focused on domestic factors. I felt like a lot of the things happening here are somehow also affected by those in the corridors in power in Washington, depending on the context that we're talking about. So I felt that was really the beginning of the research process, aside from this live experience as working for the Philippine military at the height, in fact, of the global war on terror. So that was specifically 2006, 2007. There are limits to what I can do as a Global South scholar. It was a deliberate intention for me not to write a lot of op-ed articles in Asian public outlets about this. Even articles that I wrote about the current regime in the Philippines, I deliberately only publish in journal articles because there are, in many cases, lethal consequences. So those are the limits, but I hope that, and I think that's the personal limit that I set to myself. And unfortunately, I hope that there's a time that there will be more ways that I can put the regime into accountability sometime in the future.
Thanks, Santino. So as I said at the beginning, we would also leave an opportunity for people who are joining from other than the discussant and Santino himself to also contribute. So Anne, Balazs, do you feel like raising a question? I think I saw a hand. Yeah, Balazs.
Hi, everyone. I obviously haven't read the book, so my question might not be very appropriate. Just a little background where I'm coming from. I spent about 7-8 years working in the Philippines. From 2017 to 2021, I was working on peace building in Mindanao. And my academic background is in peace and conflict studies. And one of my constant frustrations with IR scholars, or most of them, is how reified they think of the state. Now, my question is Not going to relate to human rights as much, although the Philippine military, for example, is a significant violator of human rights in the Philippines. But I really like the concept of the strategic support as opposed to aid, because I think it captures a very important part of, a significant part of international aid. So the question to me is, do you see or do you have any thoughts about key aid providing actors not engaging with the state as such, as this sort of abstract entity, but particular constituent parts of the state? So for example, the military, how international aid donors engage not the state as such, but specific agencies or specific institutions of the state with the aim of strategically influencing them. So for example, what I observed in the Philippines during the time of Duterte was this sort of competitive engagement between the US and China, trying to influence an internally, as I perceived, fragmented military. So do you have any insight on this particular aspect of strategic support to the state, but not the state as sort of a reified thing, but rather a more nuanced understanding of the state, which recognizes the internal fragmentation of the state? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So can I respond to that? Yeah. Thanks a lot, Balas. I think in the case of the recipient actors, right? So I think in the book, I tried to disaggregate which part of the state or non-state actors are being referred to. So in the case, for example, of the 1990s post-Cold War years, there are several recipient states, so even civil society actors receive funds from USAID and from the US government to actually stimulate these kinds of outcomes. What I found out is that there's a big difference also in terms of which donor country we're talking about. I had a piece recently published last year with Dr. Albert Hodsey, who is an expert of China-Africa relations, and we compared in this article how basically we compared US and Chinese foreign aid. And what we found out was that in the case of the US, it's much more diverse. So both state and non-state actors are receiving funds. In the case of China, it's officially the state, government officials, government ministries. And there is a strategic reason for that. It's because China was just interested in consolidating a reliable state actor that will fully comply with, well, that will actually consolidate their domestic power they're in, but also cooperate very well with those in Beijing. So I think there are differences. And in the book, I tried to showcase this, most especially I think in the 1990s post-Cold War era. But in terms of state violence, it's really about state actors. So Philippine military, Thai military, and also so the military and the police agencies, and also paramilitary agencies. So in the case of Colombia, for example, 2 years ago, I published an article in the case of Colombia, which is the largest recipient state of US foreign aid. A lot of the paramilitary agencies are also being funded by the US government, but they're not officially part of the state per se. But they're responsible for the perpetration of violence.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we have some time left. We can do several things. Dr. Han, Dr. Ipao, if you would like to respond to some of the things that Santino said, there's an opportunity for that right now. Santino, if there's stuff that you would like to elaborate on, it's like really the burning stuff that you couldn't, you're also free to do so.
I could just, if I may, just say that I found that Santino's explanation of human rights being meta concepts that sometimes have a neoliberal dimension very appealing in the sense that it aligns with some of the arguments that have lately been made about the instrumentality of human rights discourse and how human rights in some ways have become very effective discourses that insulate power. And so and we see that even now in the discussion about war crimes in the context of Ukraine and is a war criminal, and what are the parameters for deploying the concept of gross human rights violations, whether it's in the context of Ukraine or in the context of Iraq or in the context of Afghanistan. And so what, for the lack of a better word, one can call the duplicity and the hypocrisy of international human rights discourse becomes more evident when you take this discursive approach, which I think is really the strength of this book, going beyond what you see on paper to interrogate the power relations that inform language deployed in reference to questions of human rights. And I think that's very helpful. One last thing, the notion of the right of the market to take place is also a very important one. That sense of the tension, which is also something you mentioned, the tension between the communal and the individual. That the default when we think about international human rights is the individual. And sometimes we forget that that particularly narrow conception of human rights comes out of a particular historical moment, the crisis of nationalism in Europe following the end of the Second World War. And so that shaped how human rights discourse first emerged in the context of the United Nations. It was only in the 60s and 70s with the post-colonial United Nations when ex-colonial countries began to have voices within the United Nations that the human rights discourse expands to begin to factor in the communal and collective dimensions of human rights, as we see the right to development and other so-called solidarity rights. So I think in some of these conversations can benefit with some deeper historical interrogation with the roots of the concepts and technologies that we take for granted.
I also take the opportunity to raise a question, Santino. I don't know if I should, but so this question is more about the theory. It's pretty generic, and it may be that you answered in the book, and that I did not read it carefully enough. But here's the question. So if it may be an opportunity to sort of flesh out the argument again, and it may be something to think about. But it seems to me that if I look at the main argument, which is about human rights repression or repression as an outcome or not, and so in violation of human rights. So that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are two main variables causing that, right? A conversion of interest, which then leads to to aid or not, right? So if there is a convergence, say you get aid if you, and then there is domestic legitimacy, right? So, and you can imagine a 2x2 table where there is domestic legitimacy, yes or no, and where there is a convergence of interest, yes or no. And it seems to me that 3 out of the 4 cells are considered, but I'm wondering about the fourth. So, and the fourth, so there's so in a situation with, so let's go, or let me just, highlight the cell, which I'm not sure about. So suppose there's no domestic legitimacy and there's no convergence of interest, so no aid. What is the expected outcome? I mean, I think that's, and I'm not sure if it's empirically, so if you see that empirically in the case studies, but it seems that the case studies are more about the other 3 cells. So there is domestic legitimacy and a convergence of interest, and then you get sort of a positive human rights outcome, or there is no domestic legitimacy, and there is a convergence of interest, so aids, but then aid actually supports sort of the violence that is, or the violent behavior that's already there. I'm going through all the cells right now, I'm sorry. And there's the other cell that I also see explained, which is one in which there's domestic legitimacy and a convergence of interest, and then there's no repression, right? Because then the aid is basically supported. But what about this? Because if these are the two main variables, then, you know, from a theoretical point of view, it'd be interesting to see, so what happens in this fourth cell?
Yeah, thanks. In fact, in the very early manuscript, like half decade ago, I had like this two by two cell of what are the different permutations, but I eventually dropped it because it makes the book very messy. But in the case, for example, of, if I got it right, so no aid, so no external actor,
Oh.
and then very low, or should I say weak, domestic legitimacy. So the one sitting in power has a very low chances of political survival. Then we would see a very high levels of state repression, and it will be a very violent society, I would say. Or people have been accustomed to violence to the point that there is, I don't know, I think a state society relation in which there's silent forms of dissent, but it's not really upsetting the one in power, the incumbent leader.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Then go ahead.
No, the reason
Was that the scenario, the theoretical scenario that I was
yeah,
thinking?
no, the reason I'm asking is also to think about, so what is the causal power of the different variables? So if there's a possibility of different sort of outcomes in this fourth cell, then the convergence of interest and aid, so basically the international dimension has much more sort of causal strength or causal power than if you find sort of a violent outcome in when there's no local or domestic legitimacy, because then, you know, in case of an absence of domestic legitimacy, with or without foreign aid, you're going to find repression. And it's but if there's sort of if there's so I think it would be sort of in the whole theory would be theoretically even more interesting, strong, appealing, if you could, for instance, imagine, and perhaps that's true, right, where in the absence of foreign aid and low levels of domestic legitimacy, you find, for instance, much more social movements, resistance, and yeah, democratization. I don't know, but that would sort of, I mean, if you can make that argument also empirically, that makes the whole story even stronger, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's something to think about. The irony, though, is that I've seen in cases wherein you have supposedly progressive left-wing movements who are now clamoring for US foreign aid so that they can actually upset the one in power.
Mhm.
I'm talking about, for example, the case of the Philippines. You have very left-wing anti-American civil society groups who are now clamoring for more American support because of the belief that China is supporting the one in power. So this is a very interesting point, but we don't have data on Chinese support. A lot of this could probably be confidential and not through official means as compared to the case of the US. So it's very difficult. I think in terms of the weighting, what I could say based on the case studies is that if you have very low levels of legitimacy and you're receiving militaristic agenda oriented foreign aid, then we'll have a foreign aid that is both targeting all forms of political dissent as much as possible, including unarmed political opposition. But in terms of the weighting, I did not go through it. I was really much more interested in the qualitative evidence and building the theory therein.
Yeah. right. Anyone else? Okay. So so in that case, I would like to conclude. If Santino, I don't know if you want to say a few words before we end. Otherwise, or from my end, I could say thank you all for coming, for your really interesting observations, remarks, and your engagement. Yeah, maybe we'll talk again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.